Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Ryanbert. This time we'll continue our reading of Farther Afield by Miss Reed. Miss Reed is home again, though on her way to her own house, she is spending the night with her friend Amy. Next morning, the sky was blue and our breakfast table was bathed in sunshine. I presented Amy with the plated gold belt with which she was agreeably delighted. Beside my plate was a large square parcel, which turned out to contain a splendid book of photographs of Crete, with short accounts of the different places. It was a perfect memento of a perfect holiday. We drove back to Fairacre by way of the kennels, where Tibby sat on top of his sleeping house, looking aloof. I stroked his head and muttered endearments, to which he responded with a yawn. Only when he was safely in the car, secured in the cat basket, did he deign to give tongue, and then only to keep up a nerve-wracking caterwauling by which he registers strong disapproval of car travel. "I hope you've got a supply of the tenderer portions of the most expensive rabbit," shouted Amy above the din. "It's pussy love or nothing," I shouted back. "If he can eat it in the kennels, he can eat it at home." We turned into the school lane. My hedge seemed to have grown 6 inches in the past fortnight, and the lawn needed cutting, but the border was full of color, despite my abortive forays to the nurseryman. I felt under the 3rd stone of the right of the porch and withdrew the key. The door was difficult to open because there was a pile of letters still on the mat. One was stuck in the letterbox. It was a note in Mrs. Partridge's handwriting, and I put it aside to read later. Probably a change of date for the WI, I thought. We picked up the letters and put them on the hall table. Tibby was released and bounded into the garden, giving us time to look around. Something was wrong. The house smelt musty. Everything was tidy, but a fine layer of dust was everywhere. Unlike Amy's house, there were no flowers. Usually, Mrs. Pringle does me proud with a handful of marigolds stuffed in a mug, but today there was nothing. "Come and sit down," I said to Amy. "This is all very strange. Something must have happened to Mrs. P. There may be a note in the kitchen." But there was no note. The paint had been washed, the windows cleaned, the sink whitened with bleach, the dishcloth wrapped along its edge stiff and dry, but here too dust lay. I filled the kettle for coffee, remembered Mrs. Partridge's note, and read it while the kettle boiled. It said, "So sorry to tell you that Mrs. Pringle is in hospital. Probably appendicitis, nothing very serious, but she was worried because she could not get in the last-minute provisions. If you are not too tired, do have dinner with us tonight. Very simple, about 7:30, longing to hear about Crete. Cordelia Partridge." I handed it to Amy and set about putting out the cups. I was sincerely sorry for my old sparring partner in the hospital, and remembered how kind she had been to me at the beginning of the holiday when I had had my accident. "Poor old girl," I said, spooning instant coffee into the cups. "I must ring the hospital later on. I suppose she'll be at Caxley." "I expect all this bottoming brought it on," said Amy, gazing at my dazzling paintwork. "Don't rub salt in my wounds," I begged her. "I'm already suffering from remorse for all the things I've said to her in my time." "She can take it," said Amy robustly. "And anyway, she gives as good as she gets from all I hear." She finished her coffee and stood up. "Must be off. Dozens of things to do at Bent, and you have just as many here, I can see." I waved goodbye to her, watching until the car turned the bend in the lane and went back to the garden. My new rose bush had a dozen or more coppery buds on it, and the lavender hedge was in full flower. A few bumblebees buzzed lazily among the blossoms, and Tibby approached and weaved himself round my legs affectionately. I picked up the exasperating animal and gave him a hug. "Tibby," I told him, "we're really home." Part 3. Return to Fairacre. Chapter 14. Mrs. Pringle falls ill. There is no doubt about it, going away does one so much good because, for one thing, it makes one's home seem doubly desirable. I pondered on this truth as I walked round to the vicarage under my umbrella. The hotel could not be faulted, but how much cozier the small rooms of the schoolhouse seemed, and what a blessing it was to drink cold water straight from the tap instead of having tepid mineral water tasting faintly of soda from a bottle. And how green everything was! I looked with approval at the glistening hedges, the flowers drenched with rain, and the great green flanks of the downs where the sheep were grazing. I even felt kindly toward a worm which was struggling on Mrs. Partridge's doorstep, and transferred it to a luscious wet garden bed. There had been no worms in Crete. Come in, cried the vicar, and to my surprise he clasped me close to his Donegal tweed jacket and kissed me on both cheeks. I felt as though I had returned from some long exile in the salt mines. My dear, she's come, he announced, ushering me into the drawing-room where Mrs. Partridge sat knitting. Booties, she said, after we had exchanged greetings, and I had been supplied with a glass of sherry. For the sale, dear, but I've almost made a most unfortunate mistake. Can you see? Certainly, there was something strange about the garment. I think you've knitted a row or two with a piece of wool that was hanging down, and not the main line, if you follow me. Oh dear, it's these glasses. I've mislaid my others. They're bound to turn up, they always do. Last time they were in the laundry book, so I'm driven to wearing these. Shall I undo it for you? Mrs. Partridge looked anguished. Must you? Shall we put it aside for a bit and just enjoy our drinks? We did so, and I answered a volley of questions about the holiday until I could ask about Mrs. Pringle. I did try to ring the hospital, I said, 3 times, but the exchange didn't answer. I know. What has happened to all those nice girls who used to be so obliging years ago, I simply don't know. I can remember many a time asking for a number, and the girl would say, if it's Mrs. Henry you want, I'm afraid she's out shopping. I saw her go into Boots not 5 minutes ago. So friendly, and always had time to let you know about their families. Gerald used to find them such a help when people needed visiting. Those days have gone, I agreed. I suppose it would be all the same if one were lying with 2 broken legs and a fire in the house, though no doubt 999 might answer. Mrs. Partridge nodded thoughtfully. Except you would not be able to reach the phone with 2 broken legs, and the fire might be your side of it. Tell me about Mrs. Pringle, I said. One can't afford to be too literal. It appeared that she was taken ill in Caxley on market day. In Woolworth's, and I must say the manager sounds a thoroughly sensible fellow and deserves promotion, for he fetched a doctor and she was taken straight to Caxley Hospital. The vicar interrupted. Don't tell her what they found, my dear, he advised his wife. We are eating soon. I was grateful to him. He knows my squeamishness. Mrs. Partridge looked disappointed, but loyally kept to generalities. Top and bottom of it was they operated within an hour or 2, and she'll be there for another week at least, but nothing serious. In fact, the hospital sister said she was comfortable when I inquired. It seems a funny way to describe it when I know for a fact she was slit. Cardelia, said the vicar warningly. Sorry. Well, anyway, poor Mrs. Pringle had to go in, of course, taking nighties and things, and brought back the shopping, and was too upset to unpack it until next day. So the fish, my dear, from that jolly fellow in the market was absolutely uneatable, and the cat was furious, Mrs. Willett told me. You see, it knows it has fish on Thursdays. Do you think our dinner is ready? Inquired the vicar. Of course it is. Come along, said Mrs. Partridge, rising from the web of knitting wool crisscrossing the armchair. Cold chicken and salad, she said, leading the way. I did warn you it would be simple. I wish now I'd put some soup on to heat. It's such a miserable evening for a cold meal. Shall I do that? We dissuaded her, protesting that cold chicken and salad would be splendid, and entered the dining room. The meal was delicious, and afterwards, back in the drawing-room with the booty growing ever more grotesque, I caught up with Vicar Fairacre news. Measles, it seemed, was now rife, and Mr. Roberts Cowman had gone down with it and was in a very bad way. "Of course it will have its brighter side for you," said Mrs. Partridge. "There won't be so many children next term, which will be a help with Mrs. Pringle laid up." "I suppose I'd better look for someone else to stand in." "Well, Minnie Pringle won't be able to come. There's a new baby due any minute now." "That's a relief. I shan't feel obliged to ask her. After 10 minutes of Minnie's company, I'm nearly as demented as she is." "If the worst comes to the worst," said the vicar, "the older children must just turn to and help with the cleaning. Do it yourself, you know," he added, beaming with pride at being so up to the minute. Mr. and Mrs. Maughan, it appeared, were in Scotland for a holiday, and I felt somewhat relieved. It would give me a breathing space before having to confess that I had no photographs of the Cretan hawk. The new people at Tyler's Row were repainting their house. Miss Winter's bad leg was responding to Dr. Martin's liniment, and her sister had offered to embroider a new altar cloth. At this stage, an enormous yawn engulfed me, which I did my best to hide without success. "It's time you were in bed," said Mrs. Partridge, looking over the top of the blameworthy glasses. "You've had 2 busy days." It was true that I was almost asleep, but I did my best to look vivacious as I thanked her for a truly lovely evening and departed into the rain. Some poor baby, I thought, as I tottered home, was going to have a very odd booty. Oh well, we all have to come to terms with life's imperfections, and one may as well begin young. As might be expected, the minute I climbed into bed, sleep eluded me, and I lay awake thinking about possible substitutes for Mrs. Pringle without success. I was going to visit her the next day and hoped she might have someone in mind. Otherwise, it looked as though the vicar's suggestion might have to be put into action. After 2 hours or so of fruitless worrying, I heard St. Patrick's clock chime and then one solitary stroke. Very soon after this, I must have fallen asleep, for I had a vivid dream in which the vicar was officiating at a marriage ceremony, clad in an improbable pale blue surplice. The bride was my importunate friend on the flight from Crete, and the groom was the monk from Toplo. Neither appeared to be interested in the ceremony, but were engrossed in a chess set which was lodged on the font. I wonder what a psychiatrist would make of that. The next morning I rang the hospital to inquire after my school cleaner. Mrs. Pringle, I was not surprised to learn, was comfortable and would be ready to receive visitors between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. It was my first attempt at driving since the accident, and I was mightily relieved to find that I could do all that was necessary with my arm and foot. Mrs. Pringle, regal among her pillows, greeted me with unaccustomed warmth and admired the roses I had cut for her. "A good thing I was handy for the hospital when it happened," she told me. "If I'd been slaving away at your place with nobody to call upon, I doubt if I'd be alive to tell the tale." I expressed my concern and took the opportunity of thanking her for all the hard work she had put in at the schoolhouse, but I don't think she heard. Her mind was too full of more recent events. "Ready to burst," she told me with relish. "Ready to burst. A mercy I didn't have to be jolted all the way to the county. I'd never have lasted out." She looked around her. Patients in neighboring beds had fallen silent and were presumably listening to the saga. Mrs. Pringle lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'll tell you all about it when I'm back home," she promised. "There's some things you don't like to mention in mixed company." Quite, I said briskly, thanking my stars for the postponement. It seemed a good opportunity to ask when she might be back in Fairacre. "They don't tell you nothing here," she grumbled, "but I heard one of the nurses say something about next week, if all goes well. It don't look as though I'll be fit for schoolwork for a bit. I've been thinking about it, and you know our Minnie's expecting again?" I said I had heard. "How she does it, I don't know," sighed Mrs. Pringle. I assumed this was a rhetorical question and forbore to respond. "To tell you the truth, Miss Reed, I've lost count now, what with his first family and hers out of wedlock, and then these others. Then, of course, his eldest 2 are married and having families of their own. When I visit there, which isn't often, I'm glad to say, there are babies all over the place, and I'm hard put to say whose are whose. Sometimes I wonder if Minnie knows herself." No other ideas, I suppose? There's Pringle's younger brother, if you're really driven to it. He's quite handy at housework, but of course he'd have to come out from Caxley on the bus, and he's a bit simple. Nothing violent, I don't mean, but you'd have to watch your handbag and the dinner money. It would be better to get someone in the village, I said hastily, if we can find one. There's no one, said Mrs. Pringle flatly, and we both knows it. How many wants housework these days, especially school cleaning? Thankless job that is, everlasting cleaning up after dozens of muddy boots. I sometimes think I must be soft in the head to keep the job on. Mrs. Pringle's face was assuming its usual look of disgruntled self-pity, and I felt it was time to go. You're a marvel, I told her, and keep the school beautifully. You deserve a good rest. We'll find someone, you'll see, and if the worst comes to the worst, we shall have to do as the vicar suggested. What's that? Asked Mrs. Pringle suspiciously, on guard at once. Do it ourselves. God help us, cried Mrs. Pringle, rolling her eyes heavenward. I made my farewells rapidly before she had a total relapse. Mr. Willett turned up in the evening to cut the grass. I meant to have it all shipshape for you when you got back, he apologized, but what with the rain and choir practice and giving the Hales a hand with their outside painting when the rain let up, well, I never got around to it. I assured him all was forgiven. That chap Hale, he went on, got degrees in that and a real nice bloke for a schoolmaster, but to see him with a paintbrush is enough to make your hair curl. Paint all down the handle, paint all down his arm, dripping off his elbow. I tell you, he gets more on himself than the woodwork. You could do out the village hall with what he wastes. He paused for breath. And how's the old girl? He inquired when he had recovered. Still laughing fit to split? I said she seemed pretty bobbish and told him about the dearth of supplementary school teachers. Mr. Willett grew thoughtful. One thing, she did the place all through before she was took bad. I reckons we can keep it together till she's fit again. After all, we shouldn't need to light them ruddy stoves she always sets such store by. They're the main trouble. Won't hurt some of the bigger kids to lend a hand. That's what the vicar said. Ah, nodded Mr. Willett, setting off to fetch the lawnmower. And he said right, too. Our Mr. Partridge ain't such a fool as he looks. A minute later, he wheeled out the mower. Above the clatter, I heard him in full voice. He was singing, God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. Chapter 15. Term begins. As always, the last week of the school holidays flew by with disconcerting speed. I had time to put the garden to rights and do a little shopping, but a great many other things, mainly school affairs, were shelved. Nevertheless, I found time to call on Mrs. Pringle, now at home and convalescent, and discovered, as we had all thought, that it would be 2 or 3 weeks before the doctor would allow her to resume work. There was simply no one to be found who could take on her job, even temporarily. A fine lookout, I told myself, for the future when Mrs. Pringle finally retired. She obviously greeted my do-it-yourself plans with mixed feelings. It's a relief not to have our Minnie messing about with things, she announced, or anyone else for that matter. I likes to know where to lay my hands on a piece of soap or a new dishcloth, or where to hide the matches out of Bob Willett's way. I don't say he thieves, but I'm not one to speak ill of anybody, but he sort of borrows 'em and light that filthy pipe of his and pockets 'em absent-minded. It's better there's no stranger trying to run the place. I'm glad you like the idea, I said as soon as I stood up straight. I don't like the idea, boomed Mrs. Pringle fortissimo. She spoke with such vehemence I trembled for the safety of her operations scar. What can I do? She continued. Helpless, that's what I am, and I must just stand aside and watch them stoves rust and the floors turn black and the windows fur over with dust, while you and Bob Willett and the children turns a blind eye to it all. I said humbly that we would do our best, and that Mrs. Willett had offered to oversee the washing up at midday. Mrs. Pringle looked slightly mollified. Yes, well, that's something, I suppose. A drop in the ocean, really, but at least Alice Willett knows what's what and rinses out the tea-cloths proper. I tell her I always hangs 'em on that little line by the elder bush to give 'em a bit of a blow, then they finishes off draped over the copper. I promised to do so and made a hasty departure. "And tell Bob Willett not to lay a finger on them stoves," she called after me. "There's no need to light 'em for weeks yet." I let her have the last word. Certainly there was no need for the stoves on the first day of term. As so often happens, it dawned soft and warm, the morning sky as pearly as a pigeon's wing, and the children appeared in their summer clothes. They all seemed to be in excellent spirits as I passed through the throng from my house to the school, and as far as I could see, attendance would not be appreciably lowered despite the measles epidemic. A few were disporting themselves on the pile of coke as usual and came down reluctantly when so ordered. Unseasonably, a number of the girls were skipping together in the remains of someone's clothesline. They were chanting, "Salt, mustard, vinegar," and then with an excited squeal, "Pepper!" At which the line twirled frenziedly and some of the skippers were vanquished. 3 mothers waited with new children by the door, and I ushered them all in to enter the children for school. 2 I knew well, for both had sisters at school, but the third was a stranger, a well-dressed, dark-eyed boy of about 9. "We're living at the cottage opposite Miss Waters," his mother told me. "My husband works at the atomic energy station." I remembered Mrs. Johnson, who had lived there before, and prayed that the present tenant would not be such a confounded nuisance. She certainly seemed a pleasant person, and it looked as though Derek would be an intelligent addition to my class. "Show Derek where to put his things and look after him," I said to Ernest, who was hovering near the door, anxious not to miss anything. His mother made her farewells to the child briskly, smiled at us all, and departed. Truly an exemplary mother, I thought, and the boy went willingly enough with Ernest. The other 2 would be entering the infants' class, and their mothers were rather more explicit in their farewells. "Now don't you forget to eat up all your dinner and ask the teacher if you wants the lavatory, and play with Susie at playtime, and keep off that coke, and use your hanky for Lord's sake, child, and I'll see you at home." Thus adjured, the children were taken to the infants' room, and I went out to call in the rest of my flock. By age-old custom, the children are allowed to choose the hymn on the first morning of term. Weaning Patrick from "Now the Day is Over" at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Linda Moffat from "We Plow the Fields and Scatter" as being a trifle premature, we settled for "Eternal Father Strong to Save," for although we are about as far inland at Fairacre as one can get on this island, we have a keen admiration for all seafarers, and in any case, this majestic hymn is one of our favorites. The new child, Derek, was standing near the piano and sang well, having a pure treble which might perhaps earn him a place in a choir school one day, I thought. After prayers, we settled to the business of the day. Only 5 children were absent from my class, 3 with measles, 1 with earache, and Eileen Burton for a variety of reasons supplied by her vociferous classmates. "Gone up her grands," said Patrick. "No, she never then," protested John. "She's gone to Caxley with her mum about something on her foot." "A shoe, perhaps," commented some wag, reducing the class to giggles, and much explaining of the joke to those who had been too busy chattering among themselves to hear. When order was restored, a more seemly set of reasons was offered for her absence. Someone said she was shopping. John stuck to the foot story with growing vehemence. Someone else was equally positive that her mum was bad, while Joseph Cogg's contribution was that she was all right last night because she'd gone scrumping apples with him up Mr. Roberts' orchard. At this innocent disclosure, silence fell. I took advantage of it to point out yet again the evils of stealing, and finally request Ernest and Patrick to give out the school books in preparation for a term of solid work. Temporarily chastened, they settled down to some arithmetic in their rough books with only minor interruptions such as, "I've busted the nib off my pencil. Patrick never give me no book, and other ungrammatical complaints, which I and thousands of other teachers deal with automatically with no disturbance to the main train of thought. Before half an hour had gone by, however, the infants teacher appeared at the partition door holding one of the newcomers by the hand. The little girl's face was pink with weeping. Tears coursed downward, and it was quite clear that the hanky, thoughtfully pinned by her mother to her frock, had not been used recently. "Don't worry," I said. "Let her stay here with Margaret." Margaret, motherly in her solicitude, did some much-needed mopping, some kissing and scolding, and took her to sit beside her at the desk. The tears stopped as if by magic. "Perhaps she would like a sweet," I said, nodding toward the cupboard where a large tin of boiled sweets is kept for just such emergencies. Margaret went to get it. There was an expectant hush in the classroom as the children watched the little one select a pear drop. Would I? Would I? "You'd better take the tin round," I said. "One needs something to help the first day along." And we'll look to the days ahead next time.